Claire Miller thought her life had finally reached calm waters. After years of loneliness, she had found a gentle kind of peace in her marriage to David Miller, a quiet man who treated her with care. Their home by the lake in Oregon was the picture of serenity, wide windows opening to the misty water, pine trees framing the backyard, and silence that felt almost sacred. Claire liked that silence. It was safe, predictable. After all, she had lived enough chaos in her younger years. But peace, as she soon learned, can change in an instant. It began when Ethan came home. Ethan was David's son from his first marriage. Claire had met him before holidays, family dinners, short visits where polite smiles replaced real conversations. He had been 20 when she married David, quiet and a little withdrawn, focused on college and distant from family life. She hadn't thought much about him since. But now, at 23, he was moving back home after losing his job in Portland. David mentioned it one evening over dinner. "He just needs a place to get back on his feet," he said casually. Claire had nodded, trying not to let the surprise show on her face. When Ethan arrived 2 days later, the house changed. She heard his car before she saw him, the gravel crunching under tires, the slam of a car door. When he stepped inside, suitcase in hand, Claire noticed how much he'd changed. His hair was a little longer, his frame leaner, his face marked by something she couldn't name: disappointment, perhaps, or exhaustion. He smiled when he saw her, that polite son smile, but there was warmth in it too. "Hey, Claire," he said softly, his voice deeper than she remembered. "Thanks for letting me stay for a while." "Course," she replied, returning the smile. "It's your home too." David welcomed his son with a few strong pats on the back and quickly began talking about practical things: job searches, routines, responsibilities. But Claire barely heard them. She was studying Ethan without realizing it. He seemed older than his age, not in appearance, but in the way he carried himself, measured, calm, yet heavy with unspoken weight. Over the next few days, the rhythm of the house shifted. David left early for work and came home late. Claire stayed home most days, working remotely and managing the house. Ethan spent his time applying for jobs, sometimes stepping outside to take long walks by the lake. They spoke politely, at first just sharing short exchanges about meals, chores, or the weather. But even those small moments felt strangely charged, like something unseen lingered just beyond the surface. One evening, while setting the dinner table, Claire reached for a plate at the same time Ethan did. Their hands brushed. It was nothing, just a touch, but for some reason, the moment froze. Her hand withdrew quickly, a nervous smile crossing her face. He looked at her, not awkwardly, but with quiet acknowledgement, as though both had felt the same jolt and chosen not to speak of it. That night, Claire found herself thinking about that touch far longer than she wanted to. She scolded herself in silence. He was her stepson, and she was a married woman. It was ridiculous, but her thoughts betrayed her anyway. Over the next week, small details about Ethan began to draw her attention. The way he made coffee early in the morning, the sound of his laughter when he spoke on the phone with friends, his quiet patience with which he listened when she talked about her garden or her work. He wasn't loud or demanding like most young men she'd known. He was thoughtful. There was a steadiness in him that reminded her of David, but softer somehow, more open. One afternoon, while she was trimming roses outside, Ethan walked up, holding 2 glasses of lemonade. "You've been out here for hours," he said, handing one to her. She smiled, wiping her hands on her apron. "You didn't have to. I wanted to," he replied simply. "You make this place feel alive. Dad's lucky." The comment caught her off guard. It wasn't flirtatious, just sincere. But it stirred something inside hers, something she hadn't felt in years. For the first time, she noticed how long it had been since anyone had looked at her and really seen her. That evening, after dinner, David went to bed early, exhausted from work. Claire stayed up to clean the kitchen. Ethan offered to help. They worked quietly, side by side, passing plates, wiping counters, the silence between them strangely comfortable. When she turned to put a dish away, she caught him watching her. He smiled faintly, not shy, not bold, just aware. She smiled back before turning away quickly, pretending to busy herself. Later, she stood by the window watching the moonlight ripple across the lake. From the corner of her eye, she saw Ethan walking down to the dock alone, his hands in his pockets. For reasons she couldn't explain. Her heart ached for him, this young man carrying invisible burdens, this stranger who suddenly felt so close. That night, as she lay beside David, listening to his even breathing, Claire couldn't sleep. Thoughts swirled, confusing and unwanted. She wasn't in love, she told herself. It was just empathy, a kind of maternal protectiveness. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. It wasn't love either. At least not the kind that asked for more. It was connection. Quiet, unspoken, dangerous in its simplicity. In the days that followed, she tried to ignore it. She busied herself with housework, errands, and phone calls. Yet, no matter what she did, she felt the tension under the calm surface of her life. Every time Ethan entered a room, her senses woke up. Every time their eyes met, she felt a spark of something she couldn't name. It wasn't about wanting him. It was about remembering herself. Remembering the woman she used to be before she became careful. Before she learned to hide her emotions behind polite smiles and quiet words. Ethan, without meaning to, reminded her that she was still alive inside, that her heart could still stir, still feel warmth, still tremble with confusion and beauty. But she also knew how fragile peace could be. One wrong step, one misunderstanding, and everything she had built could fall apart. So she told herself it was just a moment in time, a small ripple in an otherwise still lake. Yet, as summer stretched on, Claire began to realize that peace wasn't the same as happiness. And every day, as she passed Ethan in the hallway, or shared quiet meals across the table, that difference became harder to ignore. Something had begun. She didn't know what it was or where it would lead, but she knew deep inside that the house by the lake would never feel quite the same again. The days after Ethan moved in passed quietly, but the air in the house felt different, now more alive, yet heavier somehow. David was often gone for work, leaving the home still and echoing with its own emptiness. Claire tried to stay busy with her daily routines, watering plants, doing laundry, organizing her small art corner. But she couldn't ignore the presence that lingered in every room. Ethan Dot, he wasn't a noisy presence. He moved gently, spoke softly, and carried himself with a calm that made her uneasy in ways she didn't understand. Every morning he sat by the kitchen counter with his laptop, scrolling through job listings while sipping coffee. Sometimes he'd glance at her and smile politely, and she'd feel that same flicker she had tried to push away since his first night home. One afternoon, she noticed him sitting on the back porch, staring at the lake. The sun was falling low, painting everything gold. She hesitated at the door before stepping out. "You're quiet today," she said, trying to sound casual. He smiled faintly. "Just thinking about how things turned out. I thought I'd have life figured out by now." Claire leaned against the railing beside him. "No one really does," she replied softly. "We just pretend to." He laughed a low, tired sound. "You sound like you've been there." "Ha," she admitted, eyes still on the lake. "I thought marriage would fix everything." "It didn't. It just made me realize peace and happiness aren't the same thing." Ethan turned his head slightly, studying her face. "You don't seem unhappy," he said. "I'm not," she answered quickly, then paused. Just ... settled. That word hung in the air between them. Settled. It sounded safe, but it also sounded like giving up. Ethan didn't respond, and neither did she. The silence was heavy, but not uncomfortable. For a long while, they just stood there, side by side. To people who barely knew each other, yet felt strangely connected by something invisible that night. After David called to say he'd be staying in Portland for 2 more days, Claire cooked dinner for 2. They ate together at the table, the candles flickering softly as rain began to fall outside. The conversation flowed easily this time. They talked about music, travel, favorite movies, small dreams they hadn't shared with anyone else. Ethan told her he used to love photography, but had stopped after his camera broke years ago. "I guess it felt pointless," he said. "I was good at capturing moments, but not at living them." "Then start again," Claire encouraged, her voice gentle. Sometimes the right moment needs time to return. He looked at her with surprise, then a soft smile. You really think so? I do, she said. You see the world in ways most people miss. You just need to trust that again. The warmth in his eyes that followed made her heart beat faster. She looked away, pretending to focus on her food. The rain outside grew heavier, filling the silence between them with a rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat. After dinner, she found herself standing by the window again, watching the raindrops race down the glass. She thought of Ethan's eyes, his quiet smile. The way he had listened to her not as a stepson or a polite guest, but as someone who truly saw her. She hadn't realized how long it had been since anyone had done that. The next morning, she woke early to the smell of coffee. Ethan had already brewed a pot and left a cup for her on the counter. There was a note beside it. Good luck with your meeting today. You'll do great. She stared at the note longer than she should have, smiling before tucking it into her notebook. The smallest things, his thoughtfulness, his calm presence were beginning to mean too much. She knew it, but she couldn't stop it. Over the following week, their connection deepened without words. They didn't cross any lines, yet every look and every small exchange carried something unspoken. When they talked, it wasn't about facts or chores. It was about feelings, life, meaning. And each time, she felt herself drawn closer to the warmth of his voice. One evening, the power flickered during another rainstorm. Claire lit a few candles in the living room, the glow casting soft light across the walls. Ethan came in carrying his camera. I fixed it, he said proudly. Thought I'd test it out again. She smiled. That's wonderful. Take a picture of the storm. It's beautiful in its own way. He turned the camera toward her instead. I'd rather take one of this. You, here, with the candles and the rain outside. It feels ... real. Her breath caught. Ethan, I know, he said quickly, lowering the camera. I just meant to look peaceful. I haven't seen you look like that before. The moment lingered, filled with warmth and guilt all at once. She nodded slowly. Thank you, she whispered. After he went to his room, Claire stayed there in the candlelight, her heart restless. She didn't want to admit it, but she was starting to care too much. The sound of the rain reminded her of the night she met David, the hope she had felt then. The comfort she had found in his stability. But now, years later, that stability felt like stillness. And Ethan, without meaning to, had stirred something awake in her that she thought had died long ago. The next morning, she tried to distance herself. She spent the day outside, running errands, avoiding the quiet spaces that made her think too much. But when she returned home, Ethan was there, sitting by the lake with his camera. She hesitated before walking over. You're out here again, she said. He smiled without looking up. This place feels different now. It's peaceful, but not lonely. She nodded, watching the light shimmer across the water. That's what I love about it. It listens. He turned to her, his eyes thoughtful. You deserve to be listened to, Claire. Not just by this lake, by someone who really hears you. His words broke something inside, hers softly, silently. She looked away, blinking fast. You should focus on your new start, Ethan, she said, her voice trembling slightly. You're young. You have time to find everything you're looking for. He smiled sadly. Maybe, but not everything you find is meant to stay. That night, Claire couldn't sleep again. The rain had stopped, but her thoughts wouldn't. She knew she was walking a fragile line. One that could ruin everything if she wasn't careful. But no matter how hard she tried to suppress it, the truth was simple. Ethan had reminded her of her own heart. He didn't know it, and she'd never say it aloud. But in the silence of that house, between shared glances, unfinished words, and gentle understanding, something fragile yet powerful had begun to bloom. It wasn't love in the usual sense, and it wasn't a betrayal either. It was simply human, two lonely souls, seeing in each other what life had quietly taken away. And though Claire didn't know it yet, that connection was leading toward a night that would change everything. It was late. August, when the storm rolled in from the mountains. Dark clouds swallowing the sunset and painting the sky in shades of gray. The house by the lake shuddered under the wind. Claire stood by the window, watching the rain pour down in sheets, listening to thunder rumble through the forest. David had called earlier to say he wouldn't make it home that night. The highway was closed due to flooding. That meant it would just be her and Ethan in the house. She didn't think much of it, at least not out loud. But somewhere deep inside, she felt a restless energy she couldn't explain. The lights flickered twice and then went out completely. The storm had knocked the power out. The house was swallowed by darkness. Claire sighed softly and went to find candles. As she lit them one by one, the warm glow filled the room, soft and golden, casting shadows that danced across the walls. The world outside was chaos, but inside, everything felt strangely calm. Ethan came downstairs holding 2 mugs. "Hot tea," he said with a faint smile. "It's all I could make with the gas stove." His hair was damp from checking the generator outside. Claire smiled, accepting the mug. "Thank you," she said. Their fingers brushed for a moment, and she quickly looked away. They sat together in the living room, surrounded by candlelight, the storm raging just beyond the windows. The air felt heavy, but not from fear, from something deeper, quieter, harder to name. The sound of rain against the glass seemed to fill the silence between them. Ethan looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "You ever notice how storms make everything feel closer?" he asked. Claire smiled faintly. "You mean like being trapped in the same space?" He shook his head. "No. I mean how they strip things down. When the world goes quiet, you start hearing yourself more clearly." She nodded slowly, understanding more than she wanted to. "Sometimes silence is the loudest thing," she said softly. They talked for a while after that, about simple things as plans once the weather cleared, her work, books they both liked. It was normal conversation, but there was an undertone to it, a quiet awareness that neither wanted to acknowledge. Every time their eyes met, Claire felt her chest tighten. The light flickered and the thunder outside rolled again, closer this time. When she stood to check a window, the candlelight caught her face. Ethan watched her quietly. "You look peaceful," he said suddenly. She turned, surprised. "Peaceful? In a storm." "Ah." He nodded. "You always look calm when everything else isn't." She laughed softly, but it faded quickly. "That's only because I've had practice." He tilted his head, studying her. "From what?" She hesitated, then sighed. "From pretending everything's fine, even when it's not." The honesty in her voice caught them both off guard. For a moment, neither spoke. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. Claire could hear her heartbeat, feel the warmth from the candles brush against her skin. Ethan placed his mug down and leaned forward slightly. "You don't have to pretend with me," he said quietly. Her breath caught. She turned away, trying to steady her voice. "Ethan, you shouldn't say things like that." "I'm not saying anything wrong," he said gently. "I just mean, you don't always have to carry everything alone." She sat back down, her hands trembling slightly. "You're kind," she said finally. "But some things are better left unsaid." He nodded slowly. "Maybe, but silence doesn't erase truth, does it?" That sentence hung in the air like the echo of thunder. Claire didn't answer. She couldn't. They sat quietly after that, listening to the storm beat against the glass. The rain seemed endless, the world outside lost in darkness. Then, as another flash of lightning lit the room, Claire saw her reflection in the window, her face soft, the eyes full of emotion she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She wasn't sure if it was loneliness, longing, or something in between. All she knew was that Ethan was sitting there beside her, and for the first time, she felt truly seen. Ethan spoke again, his voice low. "You remind me of a photograph I once took," he said. "A woman standing in the rain. She looked like she was waiting for something, but she didn't know what." Claire smiled sadly. Maybe she was waiting for herself. He nodded. "Maybe." Another flash of lightning filled the room, and for a heartbeat, their eyes locked. There was no distance between them, just unspoken understanding. Neither of them moved closer. They didn't need to. The connection was already there, steady and undeniable. Finally, Claire broke the silence. "This isn't supposed to happen," she whispered, her voice trembling. We're family." Ethan's voice was calm, but full of quiet emotion. "I know. That's why nothing will happen. Some feelings just remind us we're alive. That's all." Tears welled in her eyes, not from guilt, but from the weight of what he'd said. "I just don't want to lose myself again," she admitted softly. "You won't," he said. "You've already found yourself tonight." They sat like that for a long time, saying nothing more. The storm outside began to fade, the thunder growing distant. The candles burned low, their light gentle and warm. There was no scandal, no secret act, only silence and understanding. A connection that lived entirely in emotion, not touch. When the rain finally slowed, Claire stood and looked toward the window. "It's over," she whispered. Ethan joined her. The lake shimmered faintly under the soft glow of the remaining candles. The world seemed washed clean, peaceful again. "Thank you for the tea," she said quietly. He smiled. "Any time." They said good night, and she went upstairs, her heart full of mixed emotions. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong, but something had changed deep inside her. The boundaries were still there, untouched, but her heart had crossed a line she couldn't ignore. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought about his words. "Some feelings just remind us we're alive." She turned to look at the empty space beside her where David usually slept. She felt the quiet ache of years spent, being careful, being strong, being silent. For the first time in a long while, she felt something different: warmth, awareness, life. She closed her eyes, not in regret, but in understanding. What had passed between her and Ethan wasn't love in the ordinary sense. It was the awakening of something long asleep inside her, part of her that remembered how to feel deeply. To see beauty again, to breathe without fear. When morning came, the storm was gone. The sun shone on the wet grass. Birds sang, and the world looked new. Ethan was already outside, standing by the lake, camera in hand, capturing the sunrise. Claire watched him from the window for a moment, her heart steady but full. Nothing had happened that night, but everything had changed. The morning after the storm felt brighter than any morning before. The air was crisp, washed clean by rain, and sunlight sparkled across the lake like glass. Claire stood at the kitchen window, holding her coffee, watching Ethan out by the dock. He was taking pictures of the sunrise, his camera clicking softly, his posture calm and steady. For a moment she felt something quiet in her heart, a mix of peace and ache. The night before had changed something inside her, though no words could truly describe it. Nothing had been said aloud, and nothing improper had happened. Yet the silence they had shared had been full of meaning. When David returned that afternoon, everything looked normal. The house smelled of fresh coffee and cinnamon bread. Claire greeted him with her usual warm smile. Ethan helped carry his father's bags inside, speaking lightly about the storm and how they'd managed without power. No one mentioned the long night of candlelight or the quiet understanding that had filled the house. It remained unspoken, locked away in Claire's heart like a secret she didn't want to name. Life settled back into routine. David returned to work, and the hum of normalcy filled the air again. Yet Claire noticed subtle changes in herself. She laughed more easily, spoke more gently, and spent more time in the garden. It wasn't that she was happier, it was that she was awake again. Something inside her had stirred after years of silence, and though she tried to ignore it every time she saw Ethan, her heart reminded her of that night, the flicker of candlelight, the quiet comfort of being truly seen. A week later, Ethan received a job offer in Seattle. He told them over dinner, smiling, though there was a shadow of sadness in his eyes. "It's a small position at a design firm," he said, "but it's a start." David clapped his son on the back, proud and relieved. "That's great, son. I knew things would work out." Claire smiled too, her chest tightening. "You'll do well there," she said softly. "You always find your way." He looked at her briefly, a small knowing look that said more than words could. She felt her pulse quicken, then quickly looked down at her plate. The days that followed felt slower, heavier. Claire busied herself helping Ethan pack. She folded his shirts, found boxes, and made sandwiches for the road trip ahead. Every moment felt ordinary on the surface, but underneath, a quiet sadness lingered. Each small task carried the weight of goodbye. On his last morning, the house was still. David had already left early for a meeting. Claire stood in the kitchen, making breakfast one final time for the two of them. Ethan entered quietly, hair slightly messy, holding a small bag. "Smells good," he said with a faint smile. "It's just toast and eggs," she replied, returning his smile. "Fuel for the road." They ate together in near silence. The ticking clock filled the spaces between their words. When they finished, Ethan stood and looked around the kitchen as if memorizing it. "You made this place feel like home," he said. Claire tried to keep her voice steady. "It is your home, Ethan. It always will be." He nodded, but his eyes said otherwise. He walked to the window, gazing out at the lake where the storm had once raged. "I'll miss this view," he said. Then, softer, "and I'll miss you." Her breath caught. She wanted to say something, anything, but the right words wouldn't come. So she walked closer, her voice barely a whisper. "You'll do great things. You just have to believe that." He turned toward her, emotion flickering in his eyes. "You know, before I came here, I felt lost," he said. "Like I'd failed everyone, including myself. But you reminded me what it feels like to matter again." She blinked fast, trying to hide her tears. "You did that yourself, Ethan. You just needed time to see it." He smiled, then reached into his bag and pulled out a small envelope. "I wanted you to have this." Inside was a photograph, the one he'd taken during the storm. It was of her sitting by the candles, her face calm and thoughtful, framed by shadows and light. She stared at it for a long moment, speechless. "It's not perfect," he said, "but it's how I'll remember this place." The calm in the middle of the storm. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the photo. "It's beautiful," she whispered. When it was time for him to leave, they stood at the door for a long moment. The sunlight poured in behind him, golden and soft. "Take care of yourself, Ethan," she said. He smiled gently. "You too, Claire." He paused, eyes holding hers. "And thank you for seeing me when I couldn't see myself." She swallowed hard, blinking back tears. "You gave me something too," she said quietly. "You reminded me that hearts don't grow old, they just grow quiet." For a moment, neither moved. The silence between them was deep and kind, filled with everything they couldn't say. Then Ethan gave her one last look, a small, warm smile, and turned to go. She stood in the doorway, watching him walk to his car, watching until the sound of the engine faded down the road. That night, the house felt empty again. David was home, talking about work, laughing, reading the newspaper. Everything looked the same, yet to Claire, nothing was. She went to the window, the same one she'd looked through during the storm, and saw the lake glowing faintly under the moonlight. The world was calm again, but her heart wasn't. She took out the photograph Ethan had given her and placed it on the table. The image glowed softly under the lamplight of memory frozen in time. She traced the edge of the photo with her finger, her mind drifting back to that night, that feeling, that quiet understanding. She didn't regret anything. What she felt wasn't wrong. It was simply real. A moment that reminded her she was human. That love didn't always need to be spoken or acted upon to exist. Some connections are meant to pass through our lives gently, leaving only warmth behind. Weeks turned into months. Ethan settled into his new job, sending the occasional email or postcard. David remained unaware of the quiet emotional storm that had passed through their home. And Claire continued her days as before, cooking, reading, walking by the lake, but with a softer kind of peace inside her. Sometimes she'd sit by the window and think of that summer, the rain, the candles, the silence. She understood now that love doesn't always mean forever. Sometimes it means remembering. Remembering the way someone looked at you and truly saw you, not as a role or a label, but as a soul. One evening in early fall, Claire found herself smiling as she looked out over the lake. The leaves had begun to change, painting the world in warm colors. She whispered to herself, "Some storms don't destroy. They teach." And in that quiet golden evening, She finally understood that what had happened between her and Ethan was never about crossing lines. It was about rediscovering herself, about remembering that even after years of silence, the heart still knows how to feel. It wasn't a love story in the usual sense. It was something rarer, a story of two people who met at the wrong time, felt something true, and let it go with grace. Claire tucked the photograph into a book that night and closed it softly, knowing she would never forget. The storm had ended long ago, but its echo still lingered in her heart, not as pain, but as peace. Ethan Cole was a man who never quite fit in. In the small mountain town of Vermont, he was known for his quiet voice, strong hands, and wide shoulders that could fill any doorway. People often noticed his size before his kindness. He didn't mean to look intimidating, but wherever he went, conversations softened. Eyes shifted and whispers followed. "That's Ethan the giant from the woodshop," people would say, as if his height and strength were something unnatural. But behind that rugged frame lived a heart that longed for peace, belonging, and love. He ran a small workshop near the edge of town where he built furniture from reclaimed wood. Every morning, the sound of sanding and hammering echoed softly through the valley. He loved shaping rough timber into something beautiful, strong, yet gentle, much like the man he was. His shop was filled with the smell of pine and varnish. And in the corner stood a small coffee pot that was always warm, even if no one came to share it. People respected Ethan, but few truly knew him. The men admired his skill, but kept their distance, unsure how to start a conversation with someone who looked more like a bear than a neighbor. The women, at first glance, seemed drawn to him, the broad shoulders, the deep voice, the calm confidence. But as soon as they got close, they found reasons to leave. They said he was too much, though they could never explain what that meant. Too tall, too quiet. Too kind, Ethan never asked. He just smiled and let them go. He had tried dating in the past. Each time began with curiosity and ended with silence. One woman once told him, "You don't know your own size, Ethan. It's overwhelming." That word, overwhelming, echoed in his mind for years. He learned to stay guarded, to keep his emotions tucked away behind calm nods and polite smiles. Deep down, he believed maybe he wasn't meant to be understood. Maybe he was built for solitude, for working with his hands instead of opening his heart. Every evening after closing his workshop, Ethan would walk home through the quiet streets, hands buried in his coat pockets. He'd stop by the same bakery, buy a loaf of bread, and greet Mrs. Porter, the elderly woman who always smiled at him. "You work too hard, Ethan," she would say. He'd chuckle and reply, "Someone has to keep the wood in line." She liked that answer. It was the only part of his day that felt warm. His house sat by the forest, small but sturdy. Inside, the shelves were filled with books about design, carpentry, and poetry. He didn't tell anyone he liked poetry, didn't fit the image people had of him. But on quiet nights, he would sit by the window, reading words about love and loss, imagining what it must feel like to have someone who saw beyond what others saw. He wasn't lonely out of choice. He was lonely because people never stayed long enough to know who he really was. In a world that judged by appearances, Ethan's kindness was hidden behind his size, his gentleness mistaken for power. Sometimes he'd catch his reflection in the workshop window and sigh. "You're not that scary," he'd muttered to himself. But maybe he was to those who only looked at the surface. Still, he never let bitterness grow. He found comfort in his work. Every table, every chair carried a piece of his heart. He carved hope into the wood grain as if shaping beauty could fill the quiet spaces inside him. The children who played nearby often stopped to watch him work. He'd smile, hand him a small toy he'd made from leftover wood, and their laughter would echo down the street. That sound reminded him why he still believed in kindness, even when kindness wasn't returned. Then one cold afternoon, as snow began to fall outside his workshop, Ethan sat sketching a new designer rocking chair for a client. The wind howled outside, brushing snowflakes against the window. He looked up and noticed how still everything was, how the whole world seemed to be holding its breath. He didn't know it yet, but change was coming. In that moment, he thought about the life he'd built, simple, predictable, safe. Yet deep down, something in him stirred, like a quiet longing that refused to fade. He wished for once someone would walk into his life and not see him as the giant, but as a man who loved quietly, who dreamed deeply, who wanted to be seen. He leaned back in his chair, wiped sawdust off his hands, and smiled sadly. "Guess it's just you and me again," he said to the empty room. The sound of his own voice surprised him. It had been hours since he'd spoken to anyone. The wind rattled the windows in response, almost like the world was answering. Outside, the sky grew darker, and the smell of rain replaced the sharp scent of snow. Ethan didn't notice the faint sound of footsteps approaching the workshop door. He didn't see the figure standing in the cold, hesitating before knocking. His world, built on silence and self-protection, was about to shift. When the door finally creaked open, he looked up, expecting another customer, another stranger who would smile politely and leave just as quickly. But instead, he saw a woman. She stood there with raindrops on her hair, holding a broken camera tripod, her eyes searching his. "Sorry," she said, her voice warm but unsure. "I heard you fix things." And in that simple question, Ethan's life began to change. He didn't know her name yet. He didn't know her story, her pain, or her courage. All he knew was that she wasn't afraid to stand in front of him. She didn't flinch. She didn't step back. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt something unfamiliar: hope. As the rain drummed softly on the roof and the smell of wet wood filled the air. He took the broken tripod from her hands and said quietly, "Yeah, I fix things." But what neither of them realized was that in time, she wouldn't just fix a tripod, she would help repair a heart that had been misunderstood for far too long. That night, long after she left, Ethan sat by the fire, staring at the door she'd walked through. Her voice still echoed in his mind, calm and real. He didn't know who she was, but for the first time in years, he found himself wishing someone would come back. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, the giant who everyone feared finally began to feel small in the best possible way. It was the start of something gentle, something true. And though he couldn't name it yet, it felt like the beginning of everything he'd been waiting for. The next morning, Vermont was covered in fog. The air was damp, and the scent of pine and rain hung heavy. Ethan Cole opened his workshop early, brushing sawdust from his work table. He expected another quiet day, just him, the hum of his tools, and the echo of thoughts he never said out loud. But around mid-morning, the small bell on the door chimed again. It was her. The woman from the storm. She stepped inside, smiling shyly. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," she said, holding the repaired tripod in her hands. "I just wanted to thank you. You fixed it perfectly." Ethan nodded, caught off guard. Most people would have just picked up their repair and left a note. But she came back, standing there in her worn brown jacket and faded jeans, eyes bright like she carried sunlight even on gray days. "I'm glad it worked," said. "I'm Claire," she offered. "Claire Matthews." He hesitated before replying, "Ethan." Her smile widened. "I know. The lady at the cafe said you're the man who can fix anything." He chuckled softly. "Not everything," he said, but there was warmth in his tone that surprised even him. From that day, Claire began stopping by more often. At first, it was for small things: a chair with a loose leg, a cracked picture frame, a drawer that wouldn't close. But soon she started coming just to talk. She'd sit on a stool near the workbench, sipping coffee from a thermos. Watching him carve wood with steady hands, Claire had just moved to town after years of traveling for her photography job. She'd seen the world: busy cities, deserts, and quiet coasts, but lately she wanted peace. After a broken relationship in Chicago, she had sworn off romance. Yet something about Ethan's quiet presence felt different. He didn't try to impress her. He didn't talk too much or too little. He just listened. One afternoon, she watched him repair an old rocking chair and asked, "You're always so careful." "Why?" He looked up, his blue eyes thoughtful. "Because everything breaks easier than we think," he said. Wood, hearts, same rule. That answer stayed with her. Over the next few weeks, they fell into a rhythm. She brought him photographs to frame, and he showed her the hidden beauty in his craft. Their conversations were simple but meaningful. She told him about the mountains she climbed for the perfect shot, the loneliness of hotel rooms, the silence after a love that didn't last. He told her about the town, his mother's recipes, and how he once tried to build a boat that sank before it touched the lake. They laughed easily, the kind of laughter that makes strangers feel like old friends. And slowly, without realizing it, they started healing each other's quiet wounds. But beneath the calm moments, Ethan's old fear lingered. Every time she smiled, a voice whispered in his mind, "She'll leave, just like the rest." He tried to ignore it, but years of rejection had built walls inside him. He didn't know how to let anyone fully in. One day, Claire showed up with a box of her favorite photos, landscapes, people, sunsets. "I want to make a display for the cafe," she told him. "Would you help me build the frames?" He nodded. "Sure, but only if you promise to teach me how to see the world like you do." She laughed softly. "Deal." That afternoon, the workshop was filled with the sound of saws and her gentle humming. She moved with an energy that filled the quiet space, her laughter bouncing off the walls. Ethan felt lighter than he had in years. Every glance between them carried something unspoken, something fragile, but growing. When the frames were done, Claire ran her fingers along the polished wood. "They're beautiful," she said. "You make them beautiful," Ethan replied without thinking. The words slipped out, honest and unplanned. She looked up, surprised. Their eyes met for a long moment, neither speaking. Then she smiled softly, as if she understood everything he didn't say. The next day, she brought him lunch, homemade soup in a glass jar. "You look like the kind of man who forgets to eat," she teased. He smiled shyly. "You're not wrong." From then on, it became a habit. She'd bring him lunch, and they'd sit outside the workshop eating and watching the clouds roll over the hills. She talked about photography. He talked about woodcraft. They both talked about everything except the growing connection between them. But even as Ethan began to trust her presence, a part of him still doubted. One evening, when she invited him to join her for dinner, he froze. It was the first time anyone had asked him something like that in years. "Dinner," he repeated, unsure. She nodded. "Just dinner. No reason, no pressure. I cook well, I promise." He looked at her, her smile soft, patient, without expectation. Yet fear crept into his chest. What if she got close and realized what everyone else had? What if she left too? "Claire," he said finally, "I'm not good at things like this, things like being human." She teased gently. He couldn't help but laugh. "Something like that." She stepped closer, her voice quieter now. "Then let me remind you. Just dinner, Ethan. That's all." For a moment, he looked at her, trying to read her face, her intent. But all he saw was kindness. The kind that didn't judge. The kind that waited. He agreed. "Okay, dinner." When she left that evening, the workshop felt different. Warmer, brighter, for the first time. The silence didn't feel heavy. It felt full of possibility. Later that night, as he cleaned up his tools, Ethan caught himself smiling. He didn't even know why. Maybe it was the way she said his name, soft but sure. Maybe it was how she didn't flinch, didn't treat him like a giant or a mystery. She simply saw him. He looked out the window at the mist rising over the trees and whispered, "What are you doing to me, Claire?" Across town, Claire sat by her window, editing photos on her laptop. But she wasn't thinking about work. She kept replaying his smile, the sound of his laugh, the way his eyes softened when he listened. She had met many people in her travels, but none like him. Ethan didn't fill silence with words. He filled it with presence. He wasn't perfect, he was real. And after all the noise and rush of the world, that was what she'd been searching for. Neither of them knew where it was heading, but both could feel it a pull stronger than fear, gentler than hope. And as night settled over Vermont, two hearts that had been wandering in different kinds of loneliness found themselves thinking of the same thing, each other. What began with a broken tripod was quietly turning into something neither of them expected, a story worth fixing. Piece by piece, just like everything else Ethan touched. The night was cold, and rain tapped softly on the windshield of Ethan's old truck. He sat parked outside Claire's small cottage, hands gripping the steering wheel, heart heavy with uncertainty. The invitation had sounded simple. Come for dinner. But for him, it wasn't simple at all. It had been years since anyone had asked him into their world like that. He wasn't sure he remembered how to belong. Still, something inside him wouldn't let him drive away. Through the rain. He could see the golden light glowing from her windows. It looked warm, alive, welcoming everything he didn't think he deserved. For a moment, he considered starting the engine and leaving. It would be easier that way. He could return to his quiet life, his safe walls, his silence. But then he thought of Claire, her laughter, her calm eyes, her voice that never trembled when she spoke to him. He took a deep breath, stepped out of the truck, and walked to her door. When she opened it, her face lit up. "You came," she said softly, like she hadn't been sure he would. "I almost didn't," he admitted, rain dripping from his coat. "Then I'm glad you did." She smiled and pulled him inside. The warmth of her cottage surrounded him, soft music playing, the smell of soup simmering, and a small table set for two. It wasn't fancy, but it felt like home. Ethan stood awkwardly by the door until she laughed. "You can sit, I don't bite." He smiled faintly and sat down, his large hands resting on his knees. She brought 2 bowls of soup to the table and sat across from him. For a while, they ate in comfortable silence. Every now and then, she'd glance up at him, and their eyes would meet before they both looked away, smiling quietly. Halfway through dinner, Claire said, people in this town talk about you." Ethan froze slightly. "I figured. They say you keep to yourself, that you're too quiet, too strong, too big." She paused, watching his expression. "But they don't know the man who fixes broken things without being asked. They don't see the care in what you build." He stared at his bowl, not sure how to respond. Compliments were rare for him. "People see what they want," he said. "They don't stay long enough to see the rest." Claire leaned forward, her tone softer. "Then they've been looking with the wrong eyes." For a moment he couldn't speak. No one had ever defended him before. He'd grown used to being misunderstood. He wanted to thank her, but his throat felt tight. After dinner, they washed dishes together. Claire hummed quietly as she rinsed the plates, and Ethan dried them, careful not to break the delicate glass. The simple act felt intimate, not romantic in a loud way, but gentle, natural, real. When they finished, she leaned against the counter and looked at him. "You're quiet tonight," she said. He met her gaze, unsure how to hide what he was feeling. "I'm just not used to this," he said slowly. "Being around someone who doesn't." "Pull away, squaw." She tilted her head. "Pull away from what?" "From me." His voice was low, steady, but full of old pain. "People think I'm too much. Too tall, too serious, too everything. I've heard it all." Claire's eyes softened. "Ethan, size doesn't scare me. Arrogance does. Anger does. Cruelty does. But kindness?" She shook her head gently. "That's never too much." Her words hit deeper than she knew. Ethan wanted to believe her, but the fear in him was stubborn. He had spent too long expecting disappointment. "You don't know me well enough to say that," he said quietly. "Maybe," she said, stepping closer. "But I know enough to see your heart." He looked at her, surprised by the certainty in her eyes. The air between them felt charged, not heavy, just full of truth. For a long moment, neither spoke. The sound of the rain outside filled the silence. Then she smiled, breaking the tension. "You think too much, Ethan Cole?" He exhaled a quiet laugh. "Old habit? Well, maybe it's time to unlearn it." She took a step back, handing him a cup of tea. "Drink? It helps." He took it, their fingers brushing for a second. The touch was small, but it felt like a spark. He didn't pull away this time. Neither did she. They sat near the fire afterward, the glow flickering across the room. Claire talked about her travels, the desserts, the cities, the way the world looked through her camera lens. Ethan listened, fascinated. She spoke with such life, such warmth. It made him forget the loneliness that used to fill his nights. When she paused, he finally spoke. "Why did you move here? You could have lived anywhere." She looked into the fire, her voice quiet now. Because I got tired of chasing things that never stayed. I wanted peace. I wanted real. He nodded slowly. I understand that. Their eyes met again, and this time neither looked away. The space between them seemed to disappear. For a moment, Ethan forgot the walls he'd built. He just saw her and the way she looked at him, not with fear, not with judgment, but with something like recognition. But then, as the rain grew louder, the old fear returned. What if this was temporary? What if she woke up one day and realized he wasn't the man she thought he was? What if she left too? He stood suddenly, setting his cup down. I should go, he said. Claire looked surprised. It's pouring outside. I'll be fine. He reached for his coat. She stepped closer, searching his face. Ethan, what are you running from? He didn't answer right away. Then, with quiet honesty, he said, I've lost enough people to know how it ends. I'd rather leave before I have to watch someone else walk away. For a second, she didn't move. Then she said softly, maybe you keep losing people because you walk away first. He froze. Her words hit like lightning sharp. True, impossible to ignore. She sighed and touched his arm gently. You don't scare me, Ethan. Not your size, not your silence. You've built a life where everything fits except love. Maybe it's time to make room for that too. He looked down at her hand on his arm, small, steady, fearless. For the first time, he didn't know what to do. He'd built his life around being careful, but her presence made careful feel lonely. The thunder rolled outside, and Claire smiled faintly. You can leave if you want, but maybe you could stay for one more cup of tea. Ethan hesitated. His heart said stay. His fear said run. But then he saw the quiet hope in her eyes, and something inside him shifted. He hung his coat back on the hook and sat down. One more cup, he said. Claire smiled softly, pouring the tea. Good choice. They didn't talk much after that. They didn't need to. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with something gentle. Something real. And that night, as rain whispered against the windows, Ethan realized this was what he'd been missing all along. Someone who didn't see his size or strength as something to fear, but as something to understand. Someone who stayed. Spring came slowly to Vermont. The snow melted off the mountains. The rivers began to sing again, and life returned to the quiet town. In Ethan's workshop, sunlight now filled every corner. The same space that had once felt empty was now alive. Laughter sometimes echoed there, and the smell of coffee often mixed with sawdust. Claire had become a part of his days as natural as morning light. She came by with her camera, sometimes to take photos of his work, sometimes just to sit nearby while he carved. She said his calm helped her think. He said her presence made silence feel warm. It had been months since that rainy night in her cottage. The night Ethan had almost walked away, but didn't. Something had shifted between them since then. They didn't need to talk about it. They just understood. They shared their time easily, a cup of tea, a walk by the lake, quiet dinners that stretched late into the night. Their bond wasn't dramatic or loud. It grew quietly, like the roots of a tree, strong, unseen but steady. One morning, Claire arrived at the workshop holding a stack of photographs. I want to do something special, she said, laying them on the table. They were pictures of his woodwork, chairs, doors, toys, and tables, each one glowing under her lens. These should be shown, she continued. You make art, Ethan. People should see it. Shook his head, embarrassed. I just build things, Claire. That's all. No, she said firmly. You build pieces of yourself into them. That's what real artists do. He didn't argue. He had learned something about her. Once she believed in something, she didn't let go. So when she said she wanted to organize a small exhibition for him at the local gallery, he let her. He didn't think anyone would come. But they did. On the day of the event, the gallery was full. People walked between the displays, admiring the craft, asking questions. Ethan stood quietly in the back, uncomfortable with the attention, until Claire appeared beside him, her hand brushing his. You did this, she whispered. You brought beauty into this town. He smiled shyly. No, we did this. She looked up at him, her eyes shining. In that crowded room with all the noise and movement, they stood still. For a moment, it felt like the world had slowed just for them after the event. They walked home together under the soft evening sky. The stars were out and the cool breeze carried the scent of pine. Claire broke the silence first. You know, she said, you've changed. Changed? He asked. She nodded. When I first met you, you looked like a man who carried the weight of the world. Now you look lighter. He thought for a moment. Maybe it's because someone helped me put it down. She smiled. Then I'm glad I came to your workshop that day. So am I, he said softly. The next weeks passed peacefully. They spent more time together, sometimes helping neighbors with small repairs, sometimes driving through mountain roads just to see the sunset. They didn't call it love, not out loud, but both felt it growing stronger with each shared day. One evening, as they sat by the lake, the sky turning gold and pink, Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. It was a wooden heart, carefully carved, smooth as silk. He handed it to her. What's this? Claire asked, smiling. A piece of the oak table we built together, he said. You said you wanted to take memories with you. This one's solid. It won't break. She turned it over in her hand, touched by the thought. It's beautiful. He looked at her, his voice quiet but sure. So are you. The moment hung between them, simple and honest. Then she leaned closer, resting her head on his shoulder. They didn't need more words. The silence said everything. As the weeks passed, Ethan realized something he had never understood before. Love wasn't about grand gestures or perfect moments. It was about the small things. The laughter shared over breakfast. The way she noticed the details no one else did. The way her presence made him feel seen, not for his strength or his size, but for his soul. But one afternoon, when Claire didn't show up at her usual time, worry stirred inside him. Hours passed, and finally, just before dusk, she arrived, tired, eyes red. Camera bag hanging loosely by her side. What happened? He asked gently. She sighed and sat down. I got a job offer, she said quietly. A big one. National Geographic wants me to travel again 6 months across Europe. He froze. It was everything she had once dreamed of. But the thought of her leaving tore something inside him. You should go, he said after a moment. That's who you are, Claire. You were made to see the world. She looked at him, her voice trembling slightly. And what if I don't want to leave this time? He shook his head. You've spent your life chasing beauty. Don't stop now because of me. She reached for his hand. Maybe I've already found it. The room went silent. Outside, the wind rustled the trees. Ethan wanted to tell her to stay, to say that life without her laughter would feel empty. But he couldn't be selfish. So he smiled, though it hurt. You'll come back, he said softly. You always fix what you love, even distance. Tears filled her eyes. You really think I'll leave you? He hesitated. I think. If love is real, it always finds a way. A week later, she left for her trip. The workshop felt quiet again, the air heavy with memories. But this time, Ethan didn't retreat into his loneliness. He kept working, carving new designs, writing her letters he never sent, every night. He looked at the stars and imagined her under the same sky. 6 months passed. Then one morning, as he opened the workshop, he saw a figure standing by the door. A familiar smile. A camera hanging from her neck. Claire, he said, barely believing his eyes. She grinned. Told you I'd come back. He walked toward her, and before he could speak, she held up the wooden heart he'd carved. It was worn from travel but still whole. This never left my pocket, she said. It reminded me where home is. He took a deep breath, unable to hide the emotion in his eyes. You found your way back. I always would, she said softly. You're the only thing I didn't want to run from. And just like that, the story that had started with misunderstanding and fear ended in quiet certainty. The giant everyone once whispered about was no longer alone. In his small workshop by the forest, Ethan finally understood love wasn't about being enough for the world. It was about finding one person who saw you completely and stayed. As he wrapped his arms around her. The smell of pine filled the air, and for the first time in years, Ethan Cole felt complete. He was no longer the man people feared. He was simply a man who had been found by love, the kind that stays.